Hi, I'm Carl Sweeney.
And I'm Raquel Stecher, and this is the CineHistorians podcast, where we explore the history of cinema from across the globe.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the second main episode of season 1 of the CineHistorians podcast with me, Carl Sweeney, and with my co-host, Raquel Stecher. And we are back, Raquel, to talk about some more French New Wave, aren't we? Because
yes.
This is the second part. So if anyone listening or watching this has not checked out episode 1, probably a good idea to go back and see what we had to say about Breathless in our last episode. We are talking more about the French New Wave in this one, and in particular, we are looking at the 1962 film Cleo from 5 to 7. And I think that's quite an exciting prospect, Raquel. What do you think?
I think this is a great film, and I also think it's great because it's this sole female voice in the French New Wave, so it's a really important film to talk about.
Yeah, and just before we get into that, we are, where possible, we're going to cover some films by female directors, and that includes an episode later this season focused on the Australian film revival and looking at the film My Brilliant Career. So yeah, whenever we see a nice opportunity to do that, we absolutely will take it. We start these episodes by setting the scene. And like I think I mentioned on the Breathless episode, we're going to sort of divide up the duties on this. And one of us will introduce the movie one week and then the other one will do it the next. And that means that on this episode, Raquel's going to bring us back into the world of the French New Wave here. And there's a lot to cover here, I think, Raquel, isn't there? Because you also want to talk about the director of Cleo from 5 to 7 and so on. So, take it away, take as long as you need, and then I'll come back later and jump in with the introduction to the movie. So yeah, loads to cover though, isn't there?
So I'll just do a brief recap of the French New Wave. Even if you listened to the previous episode, it's just good to have a little primer. So the French New Wave movement, it was when this group of new French filmmakers emerged and started making these very innovative and unconventional films. There was this growing distaste for the current state of French cinema, which filmmakers like François Truffaut believed were formulaic and complacent. And there were also various social, political, and economic factors that really catapulted the movement. And so this movement starts around 1958 and lasts until 1964. And some of the key elements, these are movies made on low budgets, outside of a studio. They were often filmed on location with a very mobile camera, small film crew, featured lesser known or unknown actors. There was a lot of experimentation with storytelling, script development, improvisation, editing techniques. These films incorporated a greater sense of realism. And there's also the concept of the auteur, which Carl talked about at great length in the last episode. But that was basically in which these films were considered to be distinctly tied into the vision of the filmmaker, basically the director as the author of the film. So the directors of the French New Wave were categorized in two groups. So the first one is the Cahiers du Cinéma group, and those include directors like Jean-Luc Godard, François Truffaut, and Claude Chabrol, who were connected to the magazine. So basically, in the last episode, we talked about one member of that group, Godard. And then you have the Left Bank group. And this group was named because the members were primarily from the Left Bank area of Paris, otherwise known as the Rive Gauche. And they were different from the Cahiers du Cinéma group in the fact that they were bohemian, they were leftist, and they were more influenced by other forms of art like paintings and literature than they were films. So some notable figures include Alain Resnais, who is best known for Hiroshima Mon Amour, which is considered one of the first French New Wave films. Then you have Jacques Demy, and he's best known for his later musicals like The Umbrellas of Cherbourg and The Young Girls of Rochefort. But he got his start as a French New Wave director with his film Lola, which was made a very small budget. There were no sets. The actors wore their own clothes. They didn't even have lighting. They used like natural light. Then you have Agnes Varda, whose film Cleo from 5 to 7 we're talking about today. And Agnes Varda was originally from Belgium, but she moved to France during World War II and pretty much stayed there all of her life. She developed an interest at a very young age in the fine arts, and she's always been like a very multifaceted artist. She studied painting and photography, and she also developed this, like later in her life, she developed this incredible talent for installations. She was very much a true visual artist. And her background was not as a student of film. In fact, when she made her feature film debut, La Pointe Courte, in 1955, she joked that she was 25 years old, but had yet to see 25 films. So now, Varda, like I had mentioned earlier, was a unique figure in film history because she's sort of the solitary female director during the French New Wave. There were a couple other women working at the same time, but Varda really stands out as sort of like the sole woman among this group of men. She went on to have a long career making a plethora of films that were experimental. They pushed boundaries. They could be controversial. They were also very self-reflective, and all of them have this like rich visual and poetic language. And just kind of going back to the French New Wave, during this time, this was a fairly small community of filmmakers, and they all knew each other. In many cases, they worked together. And producer Georges de Beauregard had worked with Jean-Luc Godard on Breathless. And it was Godard who recommended Jacques Demy to the producer, and that's how they made Lola. And then the producer was like, I'm looking for another filmmaker who can make a movie on the cheap that has audience appeal and it could be successful. And then Demy introduced him to Agnes Varda. And that's how we get Cleo from 5 to 7.
Yeah, and like I said earlier, this film is from 1962. So, as Raquel was saying, that the French New Wave, the late 50s into the early to mid 1960s. In 1962, this is a moment where some people felt like the New Wave had already peaked because, you get these landmark films in 1959 and 1960. And then you get this period where aspects of the media kind of go on the attack and say, the New Wave is already dead, as it were. And there are a few reasons why this might have been the case. So Francois Truffaut, who's one of the key Cahiers du Cinema critics and filmmakers like Raquel mentioned, he felt like there was a desire for revenge on behalf of some of the establishment figures, as it were, because these guys had come along and criticized the traditional way of doing things. Another suggestion was that the New Wave figures were getting the blame for an overall decline in cinema admissions. And also the political climate was becoming quite polarized, and some people felt these New Wave films weren't taking enough of a political position from potentially either perspective. They were getting criticized from both sides in a way. So you get to this moment in time, which is quite interesting. Also, then people like Truffaut and Godard, they don't have the same level of success with their second feature films as they did with their first feature films. So you get this level of disappointment in some quarters. Nevertheless, you're still getting really interesting, significant films like Cleo from 5 to 7. So spoiler alert at this point, if you haven't seen Cleo from 5 to 7, now's the time to go and take a look at it, I think. Why is it called Cleo from 5 to 7? Well, the first part is easy because it mostly is about a woman called Cleo, who is a Parisian singer. The 5 to 7 part is, it's always puzzled me a little bit because actually that would suggest that the action in the movie plays out over the course of 2 hours. And as you watch it, does have this real-time structure. And yet the movie's only an hour and a half. But anyway, Cleo from 5 to 7 is the name of the movie. Essentially, Cleo is waiting for test results. And as the movie begins, she's at this kind of tarot reading. And she comes away from that despondent, thinking that, she's about to receive bad news, essentially. So the movie follows her and actually follows some other characters too, because it has this interesting digressive approach, doesn't it? Where it kind of sometimes becomes about other people very briefly before coming back to Cleo. But as she's going about her day, as she's meeting with friends, as she's meeting with songwriters who are bringing her new material, various things like that, all in the build-up to her receiving the test results, which, that happens right at the end of the movie, that she finds out, the result of those medical tests. So yeah, it's kind of about that. It's about some level of change, in this character, some level of self-awakening, I think, as she has these experiences. And it's a fascinating movie, Raquel, isn't it? I think a really good movie, and one that I hope some people find this movie because of this podcast, and I'm sure they'll enjoy it. Yeah, it's a really good film.
Yeah, Cleo from 5 to 6:30 probably wouldn't have had the same ring as Cleo from 5 to 7. One of the reasons I'm quite drawn to this movie is that it's a movie about anxiety, and it conveys that so effectively. And because we all know what it's like to wait for potentially bad news, like that time in between. It's nerve-wracking. Like time moves so slow, it's like molasses, and every minute feels like forever. And like you were saying, it depicts the events in real time, and I think that is one of the ways it really conveys that sort of anxiety. There's no skipping ahead, there's no flashbacks. It's all in real time. And because it's told in chapters and it has timestamps, like there's, I think, 13 chapters in total, and they're all in varying lengths. I think the last one's 15 minutes, but they're all pretty short. There's this like hyper awareness of like the passage of time, which I think induces its own anxiety, and like what's going to happen to Cleo once she's lived through the 5th and 6th hour. Is she going to be like a completely different person by the 7th? And I know that in interviews, Varda has said that this movie actually taps into 2 very real anxieties of the time. She called them collective fears. And one was this prevalent fear and growing awareness of cancer, which is Cleo's anxiety. And then there was the French-Algerian War, which was causing political tension. And French New Wave filmmakers felt like, France shouldn't be interfering with Algeria. And in the movie, this is Antoine, the new lover she encounters in that last half hour. It's his anxiety because he's a French soldier about to go to war, and he has a very uncertain future. And I like that the film ends with them both facing their fears. Cleo kind of gets her good news, but now she's attained a new anxiety because she doesn't know what is in store for her lover now.
Yeah, when you mentioned about the anxiety, the first image from the film that flashed to my mind was about, when she goes out into the street and she sees the man who's swallowing the frog, and it's kind of like, it's just
that
somebody she's passing. Yeah, it's kind of really repulsive, isn't it? And it almost kind of shows you how the things she encounters on this day become sources of anxiety,
Right.
Stuff like that probably happens every day on the streets of Paris, but at this moment in time, it produces a heightened reaction in her.
Or isn't there a guy who's piercing his arm too? That also kind of adds to it.
Absolutely. Also, I think there's a scene, it might be when she's in the taxi and she sees some kind of masks on display in a shop or something, and they seem to unsettle her as well. I think that's probably a similar moment. What I find quite interesting about it is how some aspects of the film feel very subjective, like we were just saying. It draws you into the plight of this woman and makes you feel her anxieties too. And some aspects of it feel a bit more objective, like it almost has a documentary-like feel in places. And I think the blend between fact and fiction, documentary and fiction, I think that's very Varda, actually. I think that recurs across a number of her films. And
absolutely,
yeah, like you say, you've got this real-time structure, so it feels, it's got that level of, you see these journeys play out, whether she's on foot or whether she's catching the bus or whether she's in the cab, so all that stuff's realistically depicted. And then some of the shots of like passers-by and things, they look very documentary-like, don't they? You get these long lingering shots of people just making their way through the city, a
lot of them looking into the camera.
Yeah, so all that sort of stuff, gives it that kind of documentary feel. And like we said with Breathless, it's great to see these films now as kind of a time capsule, isn't it? And just they're great as a record of what Paris looked like at that point in time. But you know what I mean? It kind of does both things. It kind of draws you into Cleo's world while it's also painting an interesting, documentary-like picture of this moment in time as well.
Yeah, Paris is like another character in the movie.
Yeah, and like you say, part of that is it does capture something of like the broader context, these reminders about what's going on in Algeria,
Right.
um, which happens in quite subtle ways, doesn't it? You hear the news report in the radio in the taxi, don't you? And um, there's also some reporting about John F. Kennedy and Khrushchev and that kind of thing. I think there's some chatter about Algeria in the cafe that Cleo walks into.
Yes.
Um, yeah, so you get that kind of sense of the political climate, even if it's not front and center in the movie all the time. Um, and I don't know, I just think there's something interesting about that. That's kind of characteristic of the approach of the left bank filmmakers. Um,
Hmm.
so is the fact that it's this kind of multi-perspective thing, isn't it? Because there's a real sense of freedom to the fact that this story can be about not just Cleo, but kind of anybody who wanders into the frame, isn't it? It can be,
Right.
you know, it could be about her friend. I think is it Angela or Angel? Her friend. She gets a chapter. Antoine gets a
Right.
chapter. Other characters do too.
Raoul, Dorothy.
Raoul. But there's something kind of fun about that level. It feels like we talked a lot about freedom on the Breathless episode, didn't we? And this
Hmm.
feels like another example of that, doesn't it? This film, but it's got a level of freedom about the way it tells its story that's very French New Wave, I think.
Yeah, and with the different characters, you get all these little stories. You get her with Angel, and then you get her lovely storyline with her friend Dorothy, and then within that, her boy, like the boyfriend Raoul, and then you get this at the very end. What comes almost out of nowhere is this love story with Antoine. So there is a lot of experimentation with storytelling. It's almost like little pockets of stories in this 1.5 hours. And even the fact that the whole movie is black and white, except for the tarot reading at the beginning, which is in color. And that is in color when the camera is over the table looking at the cards. But when you look at the psychic and Cleo's face, it goes back to black and white. Just, it's so interesting how it does that. And like you said, there's almost like a documentary feel to this because it travels through Paris in so many different neighborhoods. You kind of get that sense of like time and place.
Yeah, and it's all in service of this story about, I would say, quite a complicated protagonist, in
Yeah.
Cleo. Like, how did you feel about her? Because she's in a situation that we can obviously empathize with. Anyone can kind of imagine what it must be like to be waiting for test results that you think might be really bad. Um, so there's that. But then on a personal level, she's not always the easiest character, I would say, to relate to. I don't know if that's fair or unfair, but
I
how do
agree.
you feel about that? Yeah, you agree? Do you find her? She's a tricky character to relate to, like I say, isn't she?
Like her situation, even if we're not necessarily in that same situation, just knowing that we might potentially get bad news, that is highly relatable. And her kind of going, like trying to fill her time, kind of distract herself until she goes to the doctor for the news. That's very relatable. But then, like, Cleo's a very privileged woman. She has youth, beauty. She's a talented singer. It's clear that she's very successful and sought after, and that she has money just going into her apartment. It's kind of a ridiculous apartment, but it's like she's got her own assistant and she's got men fawning over her. So she's at this level of privilege. So what I like about how this character is set up is that she's both relatable, but she's kind of held at a distance and on a pedestal too. So it's almost like the movie draws us in, but also holds us at a distance at the same time. And also the movie has all these dramatic moments, but then like, and we'll talk about this later, but all the little lighthearted moments woven in too. It's just like a beautiful blend of things.
Yeah, I think that's very French New Wave. The fact that it can really
Yeah.
turn on a dime in that way, like you say, the tonal shifts are sometimes very sudden and
Right.
yeah, and like back and forth and back and forth. It's fascinating. With Cleo, yeah, because sometimes she's quite vain. Lots of times when she's kind of admiring her own appearance and times when she makes it really obvious to the taxi driver that the song in the car radio is her song and she kind of loves that level of attention. you
Or the
know.
hat, going to the hat shop and
Yeah,
getting a winter hat, even though it's the first day of summer.
yeah, like shopping for furs, and it seems like this is kind of a normal-ish sort of day for her. And I think it's very Varda again. Like,
Yeah.
um, there's a different way to do this film probably, where you make the protagonist much more immediately sympathetic.
Mhm.
You don't put these barriers in the way that could stop the audience from relating to her, to sympathizing with her. And Varda doesn't take that choice. Varda wants her to be kind of a complicated character.
And she does
So
that in
yeah,
other films, just Vagabond. Also, that protagonist is also one that you want to empathize with, but also very confusing and just like kind of frustrating too. So I love that Varda has these like very complex like female protagonists in her movies.
I think an example in this movie would be when Cleo, she says something like, "As long as I'm beautiful." I think this might be actually, it's her thoughts. We hear her in a monologue, don't we?
Right.
As long as I'm beautiful, I'm more alive than others.
And
So
ugliness is a kind of death.
yeah, it's all those kinds of things. And then, but even like kind of petulant behavior where
Yeah.
Angel kind of thinks of her as like a childlike person who needs to be kind of coddled as well. It's all
Right.
that sort of stuff.
Where
Um,
she buys the hat on a Tuesday and it's bad luck to buy it on a Tuesday, but she does it just to anger Angel.
all that sort of stuff. But I suppose what the character illustrates is how, like we talked about on episode 1, this movement is very much about a new kind of generation rising up to prominence, isn't it? So
Right.
I think I was talking on episode 1 about how, there's the idea of the French New Wave in cinema, but even sort of broader than that, there was the idea of a new wave of young people. And the media was kind of very interested because this is a generation of people with different cultural tastes and sexual attitudes and
Mm-hmm.
religious, habits and that kind of thing. It's a world where things seem to be kind of up for grabs. Morals seem to be kind of in flux. And I suppose when you look at it in that way, Cleo's a very kind of modern woman, isn't she, for that moment in time? I suppose in the similar sort of way, similar in some ways, different in others, but like we were kind of talking about with Gene Seberg's character in Breathless, like she also seemed like a modern, contemporary woman of the era, didn't she? So I guess
Yeah.
we could look at Cleo in that way as well, couldn't we? That she's very much of the moment.
That's a good observation because they're both career women. They're both very independent, but they also have love interests that they don't want to be tied down to. In Cleo from 5 to 7, it's the lover who comes to visit her in her bedroom. And it's clear that she just kind of likes his attention, but is not serious about him. And she doesn't really become serious about anybody until that final little love story with Antoine. But you're right, they're both very like modern independent career women of the era. It's that epitome of like that hip cool French vibe that was really just like admired at the time.
Do you think that this story and this character could have translated to a later period? Because I know that Madonna at one point was attached to
Yes.
a proposed remake, and Madonna's filmography is, let's say, uneven, but she has done one of some good films. And could that have worked? Could Madonna have made a good 1990s version of Cleo, do you think?
I think it's interesting because I saw that interview where Agnes Varda was very enthusiastic about working with Madonna, and Madonna was like, "I am a huge fan of Cleo from 5 to 7. I've got posters in my house. Like, I'm just obsessed." And I can't imagine what that would have been like to actually have maybe an American version with the original director remaking it, but with Madonna. Like I don't think I can visualize it. It would have been very interesting.
Maybe it's for the best, but it never saw the light of day. But it's a
Maybe.
fascinating, like, what if question. I saw one reviewer kind of talking about how Cleo almost could be a 21st century celebrity figure in a way, because you can kind of imagine her, being the kind of person who keeps up with the latest fads, whether it's
Yeah.
whatever the hip new diet is or whatever the new superstition might be. So yeah, I know. I think a very interesting character of the 1960s who still seems really interesting today. I don't think it seems too dated as as a portrayal of a contemporary woman in some ways.
I mean, like an
Um,
angst-ridden young, 20-something woman. I mean, that's very common still today.
okay, so is there anything else you want to cover in this section, Raquel, before we go to a break? Because I know we've got some specific things lined up in terms of key moments and things that we're eager to jump into. But were there any more general points about the movie you wanted to highlight to people?
I wanted to pitch the idea of this being a nice double bill with Jacques Demy's The Umbrellas of Cherbourg, which they're both very different movies, but they're similar in that you have this young, blonde, beautiful woman who's very young, having a romance with a man who's drafted to fight in the French-Algerian War. And in Cleo from 5 to 7, it deals with cancer, and Umbrellas of Cherbourg deals with pregnancy, but they sort of have that in common. And I know Umbrellas of Cherbourg isn't considered a French New Wave film, but it could be because it's at the very end of it. And it's a response to the traditional American musical, and it kind of pushes against like the format and plays with it. The fact that it's not bursts of songs or musical numbers, it's like sung all the way through, and it's not like this happy movie. It's actually quite tragic and sad, Agnes Varda and Jacques Demy were a couple in real life, so I think that would make sense. Even though I don't think they actually worked together, they still kind of admired each other's work, and I think that would be an interesting pair.
I think that would be a very fascinating double bill indeed. Yeah, absolutely. So, on that note, we'll encourage our audience to go and do that. Go and do that as a double bill. And when we come back, we will look at some key moments from the movie. We'll also talk about some broader things too when we get to the any other business section. So we'll be back very shortly to talk about more Cleo from 5 to 7. Okay, we are back. Welcome back, everybody. And we're still talking about Cleo from 5 to 7, and we're going to look at some key moments that we have selected. So, Raquel, where would you like to start, Raquel?
I really want to talk about the mirrors and the reflections in the movie. They are fascinating to me. From the very beginning of the movie, we see Cleo come down the set of stairs after the tarot reading, and she approaches the large mirror. And like you were saying earlier, we hear her thoughts, and she's talking about, youth and beauty, and she's beautiful and she's alive because she's beautiful, and like ugliness is a kind of death. So this is like our first moment where she's really sort of reflecting on her situation and her sort of like privilege as this young beautiful woman. And in the following scene, that's when she meets with Angel and in the cafe, and she's crying into this mirrored wall. And in both of these
Yeah.
scenes, like the mirror kind of reflects the central conflict, which is that she's young, beautiful, and full of life, but she may be facing a death sentence. It's almost like the exterior doesn't match the interior. And this harkens back to one of the inspirations for Cleo from 5 to 7, which is a series of paintings by 16th century German artist Hans Baldung Green. And he did a painting called Death and the Maiden. And it's this image of this seemingly young, healthy woman with long, blonde flowing locks and this dark skeletal figure of death seizing her by the hair. And it's this contrast between like the image of health but impending death. So I think that's really fascinating. And there are mirrors throughout the movie. Like once you start noticing them, you can't escape them. There are a bunch of mirrors in the hat shop when she's shopping for the cute little fur trimmed hat at the very beginning of summer when it's a winter hat, or the restaurant, even the taxi cabs, the rear view mirrors, you can see the reflection of the driver. In her bedroom, she has little hand mirrors. She's got mirrors pretty much everywhere in her home. And in one scene, it becomes really interesting. In the later scene with her model friend Dorothy, they're walking down another set of stairs, so kind of mirroring essentially that early scene in the movie. And Dorothy drops a coin purse, and we see that there's a small hand mirror that was broken when it dropped. And Cleo sees this as a bad omen, and that sort of
Yeah.
like touches upon her superstition about like, and we see that from the beginning of her going to a psychic and trying to find out her future. There's a lot of superstition here. And what I like about the mirrors is that Cleo cannot escape herself, even though in this hour and a half, she might want to escape herself. Like these mirrors are always around her. And because she's a popular singer, she can't escape being recognized. Even like listening to her own voice on the radio or being fussed over by the men on the street who think she's really beautiful, even like passerbys in another car trying to reach out to her. And that kind of speaks also to Agnes Varda's like themes in many of her movies of like self-reflection. I just think of like The Beaches of Agnes, her documentary that she made a lot later in life. And she literally puts mirrors inside the sand on the beach in a really interesting installation. So mirrors are very important in this film and in other films too.
Yeah, it's kind of like you say, I'd obviously seen the film before and I'd picked up the motif of mirrors. And then when you said to me that, the mirror, the recurring appearances of mirrors was what you wanted to talk about. And then I was watching the film again, and it's like, oh man, there are even more mirrors than I realized. They're everywhere. Absolutely is the case.
And even just glass on like shop windows with reflections, it's everywhere.
Everywhere, absolutely everywhere. Yeah. I wanted to highlight a few of the playful aspects of the film. And we kind of talked about how this is a film where the tonal balance shifts quite a bit, from moment to moment. And Raquel mentioned the example of the color changes, changing from color to black and white and back again. And that happens a few times right at the outset of the film. But there are examples all the way through, really. One of the moments I really like is the fact that, like we said, this is a film that takes so much care to realistically depict the passage of time. Whether it's Cleo walking on foot from point A to point B, or, the taxi has to get through the protest and all that sort of stuff. But in addition to all of that, there's a moment when she's at home and she disappears behind a kind of screen and then reappears instantly in a new outfit. I think it's after she's sung this quite emotional song. She goes from this white outfit to a black one in the blink of an eye. We don't waste the time. We don't spend the time that she would need to change costume. It happens instantly. And it kind of puts me in mind of what we've said previously, that the French New Wave, they had a different kind of attitude to making films. And that can give you this kind of playful, playful vibe, I think, at times. I think the musical elements themselves are kind of an aspect of this too. You get the songwriters coming over and you start to see them play around and you think it's going to be quite a casual run through of this music, and it almost becomes a full-on musical thing for a short time before it snaps back again. I think one of the key playful elements, though, Raquel, has got to be the film within the film, which is actually the silent film within the film, because this comes later in the movie. What's really interesting about it are the cameos from other French New Wave figures, including a trio who had just worked together on the film A Woman is a Woman. So Jean-Luc Godard, who we mentioned previously, of course, Anna Karina, and also Jean-Claude Brialy. So again, it's a reminder of what we've said before, that the New Wave filmmakers, especially in earlier years, were quite supportive of one another. We talked about that in relation to Breathless, didn't we? That, Godard directed Breathless and Truffaut has a scenario credit, and I think Chabrol's a technical advisor or something. Right. And it's another example of that kind of communal feeling, I suppose. We'll come back, I think, later to the topic of Godard and Varda, I think, won't we, Raquel, later in this episode. Lots of playful aspects. As you said, Varda isn't the same kind of cinephile figure as the likes of Godard and Truffaut. Although there is a cinema building on the screen at one point in this film that's advertising the movie Elmer Gantry, at one point. Right. But you don't get the sense that she's homaging things like Godard does in Breathless, for example. But no, I think all of these things are just examples of this romantic approach to directorial freedom that epitomizes the French New Wave. if you want to make a movie that goes from color to black and white, that has an instant costume change, that has a silent movie for a few minutes, that almost becomes a musical. Yeah, why not? Why can't you do that? So
throw out the rule book, try anything.
but Varda's doing all of that within quite a constrained kind of setup with the real-time format. So it's kind of an interesting tension there between being really rigid and then also throwing out the rule book as well. So I think those aspects
I love
are a lot
that
of fun.
film within the film. It's just like a really nice homage to silent film, and it's the rare time you get to see Godard without his classic sunglasses on, and he kind of looks like the epitome of Buster Keaton in that little movie within a movie. It's quite charming. There's a lot of charming moments in this movie.
I absolutely agree. Yeah, no, I think there are. Yeah, and did you want to talk a bit more about Cleo's friend,
Yes.
Dorothy?
Yes, she's actually my favorite character in this movie. So Dorothy is Cleo's model friend, and she's fascinating. She appears through chapters 8 through 11. And we're introduced to her as Cleo is literally running through the street. She's being ogled by all these bystanders, and she can't really escape their stares. And then she escapes into this little sculpting class that's happening, and Dorothy is there. She's the nude model that the art students are observing to practice their sculpture. And this really kind of sets us up to compare and contrast these two characters who are very different. Like in conversation shortly after, Dorothy gets dressed and they kind of move on. Cleo's like, tells Dorothy, I could never pose in the nude because she says, quote, I'd feel exposed and afraid that they'd find a fault. And I love Dorothy's response to this because she's like, my body makes me happy, not proud. They're looking at more than just me. I just think it's like a really interesting contrast. And Cleo and Dorothy are like a binary opposition. Like it's through their differences, we kind of get a greater understanding of them individually, but also it just kind of elevates our understanding of Cleo as a protagonist because there's so many things that they're opposite on. Like Cleo is anxious, she's superstitious. Dorothy is carefree. She refuses to be affected by those kinds of things. Like Dorothy wouldn't have gone to a psychic to consult about her future, but Cleo is definitely that kind of person. And Dorothy isn't engaging in self-pity, and she's not as self-conscious as Cleo is. And I just think that that's really quite interesting. Earlier we talked about the little coin purse that was that fell, and there's a little broken mirror, and I love their interaction after that because Cleo thinks that that's a bad omen. And later they're about to catch a cab because the car that they were in was dropped off at Raoul. And they see the aftermath of a shooting, and it's said that a man has died, and you see sort of like the shattered glass and the bullet hole. And Dorothy tells Cleo, maybe the broken glass was an omen for him and not for you. And Cleo's like, but you didn't even believe in superstitions. And then Dorothy said something really interesting that always kind of stops me in my tracks. She says, other people's fears frighten me. And every time I think about that, I always kind of get lost in contemplation because that's just so interesting. I love when movies do this, when they have opposing characters like this, because I think it does so much for character building. I think Dorothy is interesting in her own right, but she really kind of makes us understand Cleo a little better too.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Like she's kind of a counterpoint to her. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, she'd be an interesting subject for a movie herself, I think, wouldn't she?
Yeah,
Dorothy?
I think so.
I think so, yeah.
Dorothy from 7 to 9. I don't know.
Yeah. I wanted to talk a bit about the ending because, like you said, it becomes this kind of love story really late in the day because we're well into the second half of the movie when Antoine first appears. It seems like Cleo is a lot more kind of engaged and actually a lot more engaging once she warms up to him because it seems like she's charmed by him. She seems to show a bit of interest in him. He also seems to be able to kind of play to her vanity. She seems quite flattered when he asks her for a photo. And, it's quite a nice dynamic between them. She asks for his address. I don't know. We kind of have a sense that there might be a future there, and
Yeah.
maybe it's a more of a natural kind of relationship between the two of them than between Cleo and the other guy we see her with. So it's all very nice. And then, of course, we've still got this thing where we're waiting for the medical results, and they go to the hospital. For a moment, it looks like the doctor has gone, and maybe she's not going to get the results today. But that's not the case. She does, the doctor drives past, and he says, 2 months of radiation should put things right. And he drives off pretty quickly. But Cleo says, I've the feeling my fear has gone. I've the feeling I'm happy. And there's this kind of interesting exchange of looks between the two of them right at the end of the movie. So I don't know. I feel like the final scene is pitched at quite an interesting level because it's clearly good news compared to what she was fearing. I still feel like there's some uncertainty hanging in the air, because what if the radiation doesn't do the trick? The doctor says it should put things right. So, maybe it will, maybe it won't. How is Cleo going to react to the radiation? I mean, I'm not sure exactly what the treatment will be, but if this is the kind of treatment that means she's going to lose hair, for example, we know she's quite a vain character. Is she going to find that difficult to deal with? And I don't know. When she says, I've the feeling I'm happy, is that the same as saying I am happy? I don't know. Like, what's next? What's next for her and for Antoine? Is he actually in a more precarious situation than she is? Because he's going back to the army, we think, isn't he? So I feel like it's an ending that leaves us with unanswered questions. And that's very French New Wave, I think, because many of these films actually do have some level of ambiguity about the future, about what's coming next. So I think the ending of The 400 Blows is a good example of that, And I think it ties back to some of the things we were talking about on episode 1, that there was kind of a broader feeling of alienation at the time. And that was very relevant to a lot of people. And I think some of the way that emerges in cinema is you get a level of ambiguity in some of these movies that's quite interesting and a bit of a departure to what a lot of other movies were like at the time. But I don't know, Raquel, how do you feel about Cleo's future and the ending? And do Cleo and Antoine have a future? Where do you think it goes after the end of the movie?
I think you're right. It's that whole love story and sort of resolution is very, very ambiguous. Even when they have their sort of meet cute moment, he's kind of a pest, but then it's clear that he actually genuinely is interested in her. The fact that he offers to go to the hospital with her is just quite tender. And it's also, there's things that are confusing, like why was the doctor not there? But then he's like, why didn't you come to my office? And then he does this sort of drive-by diagnosis, which is very bizarre. And why does Antoine say that he's her brother and not like a lover or a friend or something? That's just so strange. I don't know if that's just so he could be present because he's family, or I don't know. There's so many things that are ambiguous or kind of conflicting. And yeah, I always think when they kind of look ahead and they're looking to their future, I feel like Cleo sort of got a little bit of resolution with her main anxiety, but then she gained another one because she doesn't know what's going to happen to this guy. Seems like the first time that she's really genuinely interested in somebody, and he's about to go off to war and he might not come back. So yeah, I had never thought of that moment, like you were saying, like I have the feeling of being happy, because it's almost like she should be feeling happy and she feels like there's some resolution, but she's not there yet. Like I hadn't thought of that, but that's another ambiguity.
Yeah. So I think it's a very interesting ending though. I think I like the fact that the movie leaves us with these unanswered questions, I would say. Okay, so we've come to the section of the podcast called Any Other Business, which kind of the wildcard segment where you can expect some recommendations and some broader context and stuff like that. So Raquel, other Varda films is where you want to start, I think.
Yes. So I wanted to recommend three different Agnes Varda films from three different points in her career. So the first is La Pointe Courte from 1955. That means the short point, and it's I had touched upon it briefly earlier. This is considered the precursor to the French New Wave. It was inspired by William Faulkner's story, The Wild Palms, which is also mentioned in Breathless. This is a movie about like a couple at a turning point in their relationship. The wife wants to end the marriage, and the husband does not. So they kind of go on this trip to a fishing village where they spend time together and with the community, and they sort of hash out the future. And what I love about this is there's like some really interesting shots, kind of like in Cleo from 5 to 7, you have the shots of the two lovers sort of facing their future. In this one, they're kind of facing opposite directions while they're talking to each other, and these really, really striking close-ups of their faces kind of of like facing opposite directions, and it's kind of symbolic of them kind of looking to different futures for themselves. It's quite good. So that's like at the beginning of her career, and sort of smack in the middle is another movie, I think maybe my favorite. I mentioned it earlier, Vagabond from
Mhm.
1985. That it's yes, like I said, it's my favorite Varda film. It stars Sandrine Bonnaire. She plays Mona. She's the vagabond, the title vagabond. She's like this homeless drifter who sort of defies social norms by imagining another life for herself, even though it's a very difficult one. So she's a very complex character like Cleo. And this movie, I like it because it's like part mystery, because we learn from the very first scene that Mona has died, and throughout the film we follow the recent events, and it's sort of like a death investigation. And then it's sort of a documentary too, kind of like we were talking about with Cleo from 5 to 7, how there's like a documentary aspect. And that's like interviews with people who encountered Mona along the way. And then we also get sort of these flashback sequences where we just kind of get to know the protagonist. And I just think it's all done very well. It's all very experimental, but also seems very cohesive too. And then I think I kind of spoiled it because I mentioned all of these films ahead of time, but The Beaches of Agnes from 2008. So this is at the very end of Varda's career. This is when she's in her era of the cinememoir, the biographical documentary. She made quite a lot of them. And they are so beautiful. They're rich visually, and she has like some really great narrations with them. This is where you see her work as an installation artist, and they're very self-reflective. This is very much about Varda and her life and her career. It looks back at those things while filming on the beaches that she frequented in her youth. And I love this movie, and it's so beautiful and compelling, but also like in the middle you kind of get a little primer on the French New Wave too. So that's quite nice, and if you kind of want to start watching some of her documentary films, that's a good point to start.
Are you a fan of The Gleaners and I? Because I quite like that one,
Yeah.
which is about these people who practice gleaning, or I guess it's kind of like foraging. These people who are like trying to find these discarded potatoes and that sort of thing. And it's kind of interesting because of that, but also because it becomes a reflection on Varda as well. Like she
Right.
focuses on aging, doesn't she? And I think it's The Gleaners and I think, where she films her own hand in quite an interesting way, isn't it?
Yes, like
And
she's like driving down a road and there's like trucks passing, and she's sort of trying to grab them with like the front of the
yeah,
camera. And yeah, no, I
yeah,
like that one too. That one has a lot of social awareness. That's quite nice.
yeah. I would just give a very quick shout out to some of her short films, and in particular,
Mm.
there's one from 1958 called "Along the Coast," which was it's made for a travel board, and you probably would come to it thinking, is this going to be an essential Varda film to watch? And actually, it's a really striking piece of filmmaking,
Yeah.
I think. So I would give that one a quick recommendation. I wanted to talk quickly about a couple of other significant French New Wave films from left bank figures. And Raquel, you mentioned one of them earlier, which is Hiroshima Mon Amour by Alan Rene. And this was from a few years prior to Cleo, because Hiroshima Mon Amour debuted at the Cannes Film Festival the same year that Truffaut's film The 400 Blows did. it's very different to the 400 Blows, I must say. So Hiroshima Mon Amour is very kind of meticulously structured. It's very theatrical. It has a kind of, um, the 400 Blows really draws you into the plight of that young boy. This is a film that has more of a distancing thing going on. Um, it's about this relationship between a Japanese man and a young French woman in Hiroshima. So it's this, kind of private drama mixed with what's going on, historically. Um, and it keeps you at kind of an arm's length. You never learn the names of the characters. They speak in quite a repetitive manner. It's not like normal speech. So it kind of invites you to think of them as symbolic characters, and it kind of makes you think about the broader theme of like history that's being played out there. Fascinating film. The other one I quickly wanted to mention was from the same year as Cleo from 5 to 7, which is Chris Marker's film La Jetée, which is a short film. It's, apart from one brief moment where there's a moving image, it's a film that consists entirely of a montage of still photographs. But it's so evocatively done. So it's kind of a post-World War III science fiction film. So Paris has been completely bombed. You can't live on the surface. So everybody lives underground. There are scientists who are experimenting with time travel so that they can, help to cure the present day. And there are all these prisoners, and there's this one prisoner who has this real strong memory from the past. And, they send him back in time, and he has this memory from an airport from before the war, and he sees this woman in the distance, and it kind of becomes about his relationship with this woman. It's a very unique film. It inspired some later films in quite an interesting way, like the Terry Gilliam film 12 Monkeys is, it's a remake effectively of La Jetée, or it's inspired by it at the very least. And La Jetée, it's been quite highly featured on the Sight and Sound critics poll. So it was 50th on the Sight and Sound poll in 2012. It slipped down to equal 67th in 2022, but still a good ranking. It's a beautiful film. One of the main reasons I like to recommend it is because it's less than 30 minutes long. I love it when somebody gives me a recommendation for a film that won't take me long to actually watch, and this is like 28 minutes or something like that. So yeah, I would highly recommend it, I think.
Yeah, we've done that. We've recommended short films to each other, so it's always good kind of get that experience, but not necessarily give up 3 hours of your time.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think those two films are really interesting, and like I say, they're from this kind of left bank school of filmmakers that Raquel was talking about earlier. So yeah, Raquel, like I said, we were going to come back to the idea of Jean-Luc Godard and Varda. So how did that develop in later years?
Yeah, Godard was quite a character. So in the last episode, I think we briefly talked about the falling out between Godard and Truffaut. And I just wanted to talk about the falling out between Godard and Varda, which you can actually see in the documentary Faces Places from 2017 that Varda did with the artist JR. And like we had mentioned earlier, Godard was in Cleo from 5 to 7, and he was very much in this, in it, like, working with Varda, but also just kind of knew her. And so at this point, they had known each other for a very long time, but I think it Faces Places, like they're traveling the countryside, and there's sort of this anticipation that both Varda and JR are going to meet up with Godard. And Godard is in this time in his life where he's very reclusive and withdrawn. So getting him to meet with somebody is very difficult, but the documentary kind of builds up to that moment. And I think it's interesting too that Godard was always wearing sunglasses, and JR is famously anonymous in the fact that you don't know his real name or identity, and he's always wearing sunglasses. So they both go to I think it's like an apartment and to meet Godard, and Godard bails on them and he leaves Varda a note on the window, and the language in the note is a reference to like a very painful moment in Varda's life. It's quite hurtful, and that scene is absolutely heartbreaking. Varda is very hurt. She considers this a betrayal. She calls him a dirty rat. She's in tears. I just want to like reach in and hug her. It's just so heartbreaking, and interesting that that's captured on film and we could see it. So if you go to YouTube, you could just watch that clip. It's there's a posting of it. It's called Godard Being a Pretentious Loser. So if you just want to watch the clip, you can go find that. But I also just recommend watching Faces Places, which is a really fine documentary in its own right.
Yeah, no, it is sad though, that moment you're talking about, absolutely. And you get the sense that Godard, I think he was a cinematic genius in a lot of ways, but probably not the nicest guy to be, acquaintances with at certain points in time. I just wanted to round off really with a couple of quotes mainly. So I think it's fair to say that the legacy of the French New Wave was widely felt. It was felt not just in France, but beyond France. And there are later new waves that are spearheaded by directors who found the French New Wave like really powerful and resonant. And we're going to cover some of them on this season of the podcast, but not all of them. Not all the new waves that we could have looked at are going to be coming up on the podcast, but some of the key ones. I wanted to leave everybody there with a couple of quotes from filmmakers who I'm sure will be mentioned, later on. So the first is from Martin Scorsese, who I'm sure we'll mention when we get to New Hollywood, even though I don't think we're going to look at one of his films in detail, but he'll be in the mix, I'm sure, when we're talking about that movement. And according to Scorsese, the most important contribution of the French New Wave was, quote, to give a visible image of liberty to every aspiring director. The first films of Godard, Truffaut, Chabrol, Rivette, Roma, and others gave you the feeling that you yourself could make a film anywhere, with anyone, and using any story. That you didn't need expensive material, stars, or powerful equipment. So again, I like that phrase, a visible image of liberty. Ties in very nicely to what we were saying, this idea of freedom,
You can always count on Scorsese for a really great observation about some aspect of film history. He just knows his stuff.
he always puts it beautifully as well, I think.
Yes.
Yes. And the other quote I wanted to read was from Abbas Kiarostami, so one of the key new Iranian cinema directors. And we're definitely going to talk about him in a few weeks because we're looking at his movie, Where is the Friend's House? And what he said was the French New Wave changed his, quote, it changed his way of imagining or looking at cinema. Before that time, I believed that cinema belonged to superstars, to studios, and elaborate sets. Afterwards, I could see myself and my neighbors in films. It revealed a different path. So I really like both of those quotes, Raquel. Scorsese talking about liberty, Kiarostami talking about a new path opening up. I think it captures nicely, what we've been talking about in these last two episodes,
It's a democratization of cinema. Anyone could make it. You don't have to be in Hollywood in a studio with a big budget. You can be anywhere in the world, and you just have to have a vision and collaborators.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think on that note, we're going to start to draw things to a close here. Yeah, we wanted to kick off with a double header on the French New Wave, and it's been a lot of fun doing that. The next episode is going to be, a single episode. It's going to be the only episode we do looking at the British New Wave, but still a very interesting cinematic movement, I think. And Raquel, do you want to remind people of what our British New Wave movie is this season that we're looking at?
It's going to be Saturday night and Sunday morning from 1960.
Absolutely. So a great role for Albert Finney in that movie. Hope you can check out the film, listeners, if you haven't seen it before. At this point, I just want to remind everybody that we would love you to rate and review the podcast if you've enjoyed this episode. That would be really helpful to us. It helps more people to find us. It helps us appear in searches and that sort of thing. So we'd love a 5-star review. We'd love just a short, positive write-up of the podcast. Thank you very much if you're able to do that for us. And how can people support us on YouTube, Raquel?
Yeah, you can find us on YouTube at CineHistorians, and feel free to smash that subscribe button or gently tap the like button, set the notification bell for future episodes, and leave us a comment.
Great stuff. So thanks everybody for joining us for this episode about the French New Wave and Cleo from 5 to 7. We will be back very soon with a new episode of CineHistorians. You can find the CineHistorians at cinehistorians.com and on X, Letterboxd, and YouTube at CineHistorians.
If you're interested in supporting the show, please consider leaving us a Ko-fi. You can find our Ko-fi link and all of our other links in the show notes. Thank you for listening and happy viewing.